Thanks very much, John. I appreciate it. And thanks for muting the mics now. Welcome. This is an exciting part of the reading group because we get to move into the three middle chapters of the human condition: labor, work, and action. I just want to do a little bit of work to remind us of where these chapters come from. And then move on. I know we also had read the last chapter of the public and private section for today on goodness, and if we have questions about that, we're happy to talk about them. But these three chapters on labor, work, and action are an attempt to articulate what Arendt calls the vita activa, the active life. Which, if you recall back from the introduction, she opposes to the vita contemplativa, the life of the mind, the life of thought. The vita activa is not simply political, as it had been for Aristotle, but is the life of unquiet, the life in which we do things, where we're active in the world. She then also makes the distinction between the vita activa and the vita contemplativa, whereas contemplation, or the life of contemplation, is concerned with eternity, what lasts forever, whereas the vita activa, the life of action, is concerned with immortality, that which humans can aspire to, not as an infinite, but as attaining the immortality of something like the gods. And you'll recall that at the end of the introduction, we spent a fair bit of time on these pages separating and distinguishing eternity from immortality, such that Arendt says that the task and potential greatness of mortals, of humans, is to produce things, works, deeds, and words, which deserve to be, and to a degree are immortal, right? This is what humans can and should do for Arendt. To produce a public world that lasts, and that despite our mortality as private citizens, we will create things that last. The public and private section, which comes between this introduction and then these three sections on the vita activa, are about the particular spaces of public life where we create a world, immortal things through politics. Private life, where we, in a sense, hide, and in hiding, gather the energy to enter the public world in such a way that we can create works, deeds, and words that are and deserve to be immortal. And then this new in-between realm, the social realm, which she worries is threatening to, in a sense, destroy the difference, and thus both the public and the private realm. So we go on this little interlude, and the last chapter of this public and private section is on, in a sense, the fact that some deeds belong to one world, the public world, and some to the private world. And she focuses in this case on goodness, which she argues can only exist in the private world. And so one consequence of the rise of the social, and thus the loss of the public and private, is the loss of the public world, and thus immortality and politics. But another is the loss of the private world. And she says that's not inconsequential, that matters. And one of the things that we lose in losing the private world is goodness. As you all know by now, this is the topic of our conference in the fall on October 15th and 16th. And we will be asking about why the private matters. Most people focus on the public in Arendt. We're going to be focusing on the private this year at the conference. So the vita activa is this world traditionally of the public, the world in which we build and create an immortal world together. There are three parts of it: action, work, and labor. Traditionally, labor was at the lowest end of the spectrum. So when Aristotle and others in the ancient world consider labor, they associate it with necessity versus freedom. So that freedom is considered something that we do when we act, or maybe when we work. But labor was a menial task simply to need to live, and it was the lowest part of the vita activa. One of the arguments of this book, and one of the insights of the book, not completely original to Arendt, but in this way important for her work, is that not only has the vita activa supplanted the vita contemplativa, so that the active life now trumps the contemplative life, but within the vita activa, labor now has the highest standing above both work and action. The full argument for that claim is not really made until the very end of the book, and so, to the extent you're interested, chapters 42, 43, and 44 at the very end of the book draw out many of the implications that one encounters in these chapters on labor. And if you're finding it difficult, which I think it is, part of that is because she does sort of save those implications till the very end. And I will try and do a little bit today and the next meeting to draw that out, and then we'll obviously come back to it at the very end. But reading chapters 42, 43, and maybe even 44 would be helpful if you have the time and you're interested in it. Let me do a quick setup of the labor chapter, and then I'll stop and ask for some questions. Labor, as I said, was once the lowest activity of the vita activa, and now it's the highest. Why is labor the highest? Because today, the thing we value most, the value we place the highest worth upon, is happiness. Utilitarianism, utility, the idea of safety, security, abundance, acquisition, and labor is the activity of acquiring and building, and thus securing the blessings of glad tidings and life, but glad tidings in the sense of goods. Labor in this sense, she's already discussed a fair bit in the public and private chapters on pages 42 through 45. It's worth just going back briefly to those pages, because that's the section on the social, if you remember, that we read and spent a lot of time on last week and the week before as well. It's one of the most important sections of the book. And what she's talking about there, again through Karl Marx, through Karl Marx, is this idea that man has become socialized man. That for Smith, the invisible hand creates one interest, one desire, namely acquisition and economic growth, which governs all interactions in society in sort of an invisible way. But for Marx, we move from the individual interest to class interests and even to societal interests, such that all of society is to pursue one common interest, one idea, scientifically derived, which is supposed to direct human society, which is a combination of growth and increasing human dominance of nature, and thus increasing human freedom as a social being who pursues social interest, harmonized interest, and tries to remake the world according to the socialized interest of mankind. This is her reading of Marx. It's let's just concede it's a very powerful and in that sense a controversial reading of Marx, but she reads Marx philosophically as part and parcel of the same project that is engaged in by Adam Smith and the physiocrats and the economists, which is to create a science of society, namely economics, which will allow man, individual man, to unite in classes and eventually into one class, the proletariat, which represents the interests of all of man and will pursue a remaking through labor of the world towards the common social interests of mankind. So that's sort of because I think these first couple of sections on labor are a little confusing, I wanted to give that introduction and set up what labor is doing here. Labor is important as part of the vita activa because in labor we act. I say act. I should be careful with my words. In labor, man, out of necessity, is motivated to do things, namely to secure both the necessities of life, but also luxuries and consumption goods. And in doing so, man acts in the world. Thus, it's part of the vita activa. Because it's driven by necessity for Arendt, it's the lowest part of the vita activa, but it's still part of the vita activa, and it's part of what leads man to act in the world. Before I go on and talk about chapters 11 through 13, are there questions that anyone has? You can either turn your mic on and speak. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah.
Hi. I just had a question, and perhaps I'm missing something in the text in this section. But one thing about Marx that to me is absolutely crucial to his thought is this idea of dead labor, that the process of labor in capitalist production creates this sediment, right, which then takes on a life of its own and sort of removes the human agent from production, right? And so now we have this machinery. I mean, in this sort of Victorian sense, right, that is now ordering life for taking away in a sense or diminishing the sphere of human action, right? And it has taken on a life of its own. Today we might describe that as similar to like technology or robotics or something like that. But even in that sense, there even in Marx's time, there was a sense that that production had created itself something akin to the natural world, and that there's so many enterprises and so on that you can't count them all, and so it's created in a sense a new kind of ecosystem with weather systems and other things, and almost like kind of like natural forces. I mean, Marx, you like the supernatural language of vampires and werewolves and so on to describe this. That's just something that I'm not seeing Arendt addressing in this section.
Okay. Thank you. I'm somewhat assuming by dead labor you have something like surplus labor in mind. But because I mean, dead labor is not per se. I mean, she has alienated labor, surplus labor. I'm not sure what dead labor exactly means in your translation, but if I understand what you're saying, and I think you're saying something very important and right, it is that for Marx, labor power, surplus labor power, is the productivity of labor, which doesn't actually lead to the creation of things that would be static or last, but that simply leads to the production of things that are consumed, which requires more labor to consume more things, which requires more labor to consume more things, right? And that for Arendt, and I think this is what you were getting at, what Marx's theory of labor is the introduction of process into the modern world through the idea of science. It's hinted at in chapters 11 through 13, what we just read. It becomes dominant in chapter 14, right, which we're going to talk about next session. And then in chapters 42, 43, and 44, you'll get it full on. In what she's arguing, the core to understanding Marx for Arendt is to understand that she reads him as a scientist, as a scientist. And as a scientist, he's someone who looks at the world as a series of processes, both that can be understood, but that eventually come to drive themselves. They become automatic in nature. So we have a couple of sayings that are common in economics. Money begets money, right? In the capitalist slogan, or capital begets capital. And from Arendt's point of view, that kind of process takes human activity and human volition and human power out of the equation and puts us on a path towards where we can't actually do anything to stop the system of capital accumulation and growth. And growth itself becomes the only goal. And that's okay, because growth equals happiness, because we keep getting more things. And so that aspect of how labor is alienated from not only me as a laborer, but also the thing that I make, and turned into an unending process, which I think is what you meant by dead labor, is exactly what she's talking about is on pages 88 and 89 about the transformation of labor into surplus labor as labor power, which becomes the means of its own production and reproduction, and thus can be used for the reproduction of more than one life process, as she says on page 88, and never produces anything but life. Now, the key word there is life. And this is the key, the central key to understanding the section on labor is understanding the connection between labor and life, which is the focus of chapter 13. We'll get there in a couple of minutes, but to say something briefly about it, the life process is a cyclical process. And by that, I mean it goes in a circle. So if you think of ants are born, they die, they're born, they die, they're born, they die. Not individual ants, but ants as a social species. Humans, we say we're born and we die, and we say that death stops and is unique and is important because we are individual humans. For Arendt, that individuality it only emerges out of a world, and it only emerges because we tell stories about ourselves and our families and our friends and people, and in doing so, we create a world that lasts beyond the biological life of our species. Labor is focused on the biological life of our species. It's focused on the constant growth and survival of the species man, not on individual men. And so it's about eternity in the sense of infinite species continuation, not immortality, not in the sense of building a world that lasts as an artifice. And we need to make sure we come to understand that in section 13. And I'll get to that in a sec. Did I answer? Is that fair, Maurizio? Do you ever want to
I think I think you make the point about the surplus labor, and that's really, I was thinking of Marx's metaphor as capital as a vampire sucking the life out of people, right? And it seems that for Arendt, Arendt really centers the human and the human agent, and it just seems that for Marx, he does. It's almost as if Marx wants to recenter the human, and he seems to be sort of so much more concerned about process and the way that process yeah, like as you said, undermines the human agent. And again, we can see this as well in industry, pollution, waste, and so on, where we've transformed the ecosystem so much that future generations will have mountains of trash to explore in the same way that people explore caves, or in the same way that people explored the New World or whatever. And so that was sort of a distinction that I was trying to draw. But thanks very much.
Yep. So I'm just gonna I want to quickly just go over some basics of chapter 12. Chapter 11 is a reading of Marx. I've already talked a bit about it. The key parts of it are her argument that and this is what Maurizio was just saying, that whereas Aristotle saw man as a rational animal, Marx saw man as a laboring animal. That man is someone who creates the conditions of his own existence, the anima laborans, and in doing so, this laboring animal elevates labor, namely the creation of the conditions of existence, to his highest goal and highest activity. And what he can do, therefore, is create life in the sense of creating a new world in which he can live freely. That's the communist ideal in a Marxist society. It is the attempt to, through labor, remake our world. And that, for Marx, is the highest human activity. In chapter 12, Arendt makes a distinction which is crucial for her work between labor and work, between the thing character of work and the process character of labor, such that when I labor, I work with my hands. With my body and my back and my legs, and I put brute force into it in order to satisfy necessity. And then the key thing is I leave nothing behind. When I produce some bread, we eat it. When I produce a Bic pen, we use it and we throw it away, and we create the mountains of trash that Maurizio was talking about. So she makes this distinction within labor between labor and work. Work is the work of the hands, where we create things that last, things of use that are part of the durable world. And this distinction is deeply important for her because it allows us to distinguish a kind of labor that is worldless labor versus work, which is worldly. And she says that this distinction is often confused in Marx and others and in Smith, and that she's trying to point it out to us. It's a distinction that is preserved in languages. We have different words for labor and work in most modern languages, Werk und Arbeit in German, and she goes through a number of them. And she's saying it speaks to something real, that there's a distinction between labor, which produces things that are consumptive and thus not lasting, and work, which produces things that are lasting and durable. That's what I want to say about chapters 11 and 12 now, because I want to focus on chapter 13. Are there questions before I move on to chapter 13 that anyone has? Okay. None? All right, so let's look at chapter 13. Chapter 13 actually should be read in conjunction with chapter 14. I split them up because of the way we're reading it, and I wanted that way to have two classes to talk about them. They're the two core chapters of the labor section of the book, along with the section on consumption, I think, which is 17, I believe. But chapter 13 is called Labor and Life, and we need to take that with utter seriousness. What is the relation between labor and life? Well, I talked to you before about this idea that life for her, biological life, is cyclical. And in biological life, there's no birth and death, right? Ants aren't born and they don't die. They simply come in and go out, and there's no individuals. She says on page 96, nature and the cyclical movement, this is the bottom of the page, into which she forces all living things, know neither birth nor death as we understand them, right? The birth and death of human beings are not simple occurrences, but are related to a world into which single individuals, unique and unexchangeable and unrepeatable entities, appear and from which they depart. Birth and death presuppose a world. So life, natural life, cyclical life, biological life is this unworldly coming and going, gradually growing, decaying, growing, decaying, growing, decaying of the natural world, which can only be seen, she argues, from a human world. Right? Ants don't realize that they're just in this biological cycle. They think they're engaged in their life. But from the point of view of a lasting world, when we look at the natural world, the biological world, we see that life is cyclical. And that's what she says at the bottom of page 97, right? It is only within the human world that nature's cyclical movement manifests itself as growth and decay. Labor, and this is the next move, is also cyclical and natural. It has no endpoint. See, when we work as an artist or we work as a craftsman and we build a table, and that table is going to last generations, there's an endpoint. It's the thing itself. But when we labor, we produce bread. This is our quintessential example. And that's something, but we're going to eat the bread. The bread is not the endpoint. What's the endpoint? Life, growth. Labor doesn't seek to achieve any particular endpoint. It simply moves, as she says, in the same circle which is prescribed by the biological process of the living organism. This is at the bottom of page 98. Right? Labor simply seeks to, and this is like the vampire squid that Maurizio was talking about, labor simply captures us up in a process of production, consumption, production, consumption, production, consumption, such that labor doesn't actually serve any ends except for the concern of keeping the life process going. This is crucial to what she's saying. So on 98 to 99, she says, when Marx defined labor as man's metabolism with nature. What does she mean by metabolism with nature? It means that, excuse me one second. It means that labor is the way that man joins with nature, to work with nature, to become one with nature, in whose process, she continues, nature's material is adapted by a change of form to the wants of man. So in laboring, we change nature, we pave the roads, we remake grain into bread, so that labor has incorporated itself with its subject. That's into nature. Labor and nature, like metabolism, join together And he said, and thus he indicates that he was speaking physiologically. We join with the world in labor, and that labor and consumption are but two stages of the ever recurring cycle of biological life. Biological life needs labor and consumption. Biological life needs labor and consumption. It needs labor and consumption. And it goes on and on. This cycle, she says, needs to be sustained through consumption. You know, this is why, if you want to think about our economy, and why when we're talking about our economy, everyone keeps saying we need growth, we need growth, we need growth. Well, our biological life as laboring being needs consumption so that we can have an excuse to labor. Otherwise, we would be producing things that we couldn't use. So we need consumption. That's why consumption has to grow, which is why taxes have to be kept low constantly. Whatever labor produces, I continue, is meant to be fed into the human life process almost immediately. And this consumption, regenerating the life process, produces, or rather reproduces, new labor power. As we consume, what do we need? We need more laboring so that we can buy what we consume it, and then consume more and labor more. And so what she's saying is that labor, as understood by Marx and as presented in Marx's thought, is productive consumption. That's what labor is. It's producing in order to consume. This is in footnote 35, right? Marx called labor productive consumption and never lost sight of its being a physiological condition. Laboring is about producing so we can consume. Labor to consume. And that is the first major idea here in this chapter, that we labor in order to consume, and in doing so, we preserve life in the sense of cyclical and biological life. I'll stop there. Are there questions about that? Because this is core to understanding what's going to come next in the next few chapters, and I want to stop and make sure people are understanding it, or at least thinking they do. Are there questions about that? Or is this obvious? Maybe it's obvious to people.
Roger, would you maybe characterize labor as, I guess, being destructive of the world and work being creative of the world? Or is that too harsh of a distinction, or is destruction too harsh of a word to use there?
That's an excellent question, Rod, and that's what she takes up on page 100 and the next page. There's two standpoints from which to view labor, she says. So if you look in the middle of the page, she says, the destructive, devouring aspect of the laboring activity, to be sure, is visible only from the world. So from the point of view of the human world, labor is destructive, because what does it do? It constantly devours all matter. So right above that, in the paragraph above that, she says that labor is a devouring process that seizes and destroys matter. So when we take the grain and make it into bread, we destroy. When we take the park and turn it into pavement, we destroy. But not only that, we don't destroy the park to get pavement. Pavement is simply there to promote life. It will be destroyed when it needs to be destroyed. And so labor is an inherently destructive process from the standpoint of the world. But from the viewpoint of nature, right, in the next sentence in that paragraph, from the viewpoint of nature, it is work rather than labor that is destructive, since the work process takes matter out of nature's hands without giving it back to her. If I create a sculpture, I take the rock out of nature and I make it permanent, and we stop the destructive process, the cyclical process that is life. And then in the next paragraph, we get to the second part of what you're asking. Equally bound up with the recurring cycles of natural movements, but not quite so urgently imposed upon man by the conditions of life itself, is the second task of laboring, which is not the destructive task, but the constructive task, right? Namely, the unending fight against the processes of growth and decay through which nature forever invades the human artifice, threatening the durability of the world and its fitness for human use. The protection and preservation of the world against natural processes are among the toils which need the monotonous performance of daily repeated chores. In order to preserve our buildings, whether it's the Parthenon or the World Trade Center, we have to constantly rebuild them. We have to constantly toil and labor. You know, I'm putting a new roof on my house. I have to put a new plank on the house. I have to mow the lawn. I have to daily labor in order to protect the world against the natural processes of growth and decay. So that labor can have a work-like function of preserving and protecting the world, but it also has a laboring-like destructive process of devouring the world. And that's why that distinction is where the distinction, on the one hand, between labor and work, and yet even menial labor, you know, mowing the lawn, which isn't really work, can be brought into a service of protecting the world against the decay of nature. You understand that? Does that make sense, Rod?
Yeah, I think so. It seems to me that there's some aspect of this that requires intentionality. What is the agent's intention in the activity in the world?
Some of it.
I wonder if maybe we can get into that a little bit, or if that's discussed at some point.
Yeah, no, it's a good point, and it's a good question. You know, there's some of that. More important for Arendt than the intention of the agent is the quality of the thing produced. So what I mean by that is a baker and an artist may both intend to make a piece of something, right? A bread or a artwork. And their intention is not maybe that different. Baker can go about it very intentionally, just like an artist can. But what distinguishes them is that the baker makes something that will not last, and the artist makes something that will. The baker, helps preserve our world by feeding us, but in the end, he also serves the process of life and nature and decay. And so, from Arendt's point of view, the more important distinction is not amongst the laborer and the worker, but between the product of labor and the product of work. She'll say this, if you're interested, at the beginning of chapter 12. So on pages 93 to 94, primarily on 94, where she says the distinction between a bread whose life expectancy in the world is hardly more than a day, and a table which may easily survive generations of men, is certainly more obvious and decisive than the difference between a baker and a carpenter, right? And that doesn't mean there's no difference between a baker and a carpenter, but what matters more is the thing they produce, because the point of the distinction is it's being in the world, its durability or non-durability for her. I see there's a couple of questions written, so I'm going to look at one of them. So the first one says, Arendt sees life then as a life of the species rather than the individual. So yes, the answer to that is within what the great achievement, and I use that word dubiously, of Marx for Arendt is that Marx turns life in human life into species life. The idea that Marx sees man as what he calls a Gattungswesen, um, uh, a species being, right? Is the socialization of man, thus the turning of man into a being with one interest, namely life and happiness, and that turns man into simply a member of a species as opposed to an individual who can act as an individual. So then the next question of Philos is death labor or work? Labor is destructive and devours, but then there is a recycling of what is destroyed. Well, in an ant or in a biological sense, I don't think death is either labor or work. It's just part of life. And there actually is no death. There's simply the continuation of the species. If there's no individual, there is no death. There's only species life, which is perpetuated. So only in the human world is there death, at which point death is neither labor nor work, as I understand it. It's something that happens to man, but the way we die can be laborious in the sense that we simply bury it ourselves, or are buried, or waste away in nature, or we can be buried in a fancy way and tough stories told us about us, and our death can be remembered in such a way that it takes us out of the species being of life and inserts us into a human world. And that's why you'll see a number of pages on the importance of memory and remembering in these sections, because it's through telling stories and remembering that humans do the work of extracting ourselves from biological life and putting ourselves into human life. There's another question from someone. I think that labor today in our Western society produces too much because we are unable to consume in the rate we produce. We are unable to consume in the rate we produce. When that happens, of course, we have excess goods that need to be thrown out, or they become cheaper, and that throws the economy into a tailspin. Human beings, only seen biologically, have to labor in order to consume and keep the cycle going. But we as humans are not only biological beings, we need more in order to be happy. Okay, good. I think that's very much Arendt's view. I think man would be much happier by less producing, less consuming, and get back to simpler things, just these we need to make us happy. These are not being products. Okay, so, I mean, this is a widely held view today. I mean, not so widely because it's still a strongly minority view, namely that we could just stop producing so much and live a little more simply. And in doing so, we would escape this kind of dominance of the biological life of our laboring species being. It's an important question. I think it's one of the most important questions, but it's not clear how one simply turns this off. This was the question that was asked earlier by Maurizio. I mean, from Marx's point of view, once this starts, it becomes a process that is very hard to stop. I mean, Max Weber explores this in his work. You know, once you have a chain store which produces things more cheaply, more efficiently, and often better than a mom and pop store can do, it's very hard for the mom and pop stores to stay in business because they just can't compete on price, location, or quality in the end. Once there's mass production of books, it's very hard for someone who makes books by hand to compete. The books are too expensive and they're not as good, usually. And so, how do you stop this process, right? This becomes one of the questions that will come up in the chapter on action and then at the end of the book as well. Because what Arendt is going to argue is that in the modern world of processes, the only way to act is to actually insert a new process into the world, a new theory, a new idea that will actually become a new process whose outcome we don't know what it will be. And so from Arendt's perspective, the only people who can act in the modern world are actually scientists. People who can, in a sense, like Marx or like Smith or like Einstein, invent and create a new process that will counter or at least change some of the processes that we're currently living according to. Individual action becomes increasingly rare and irrelevant, right? This is what we were talking about 2 meetings ago when we were talking about statistics and the law of large numbers and the rise of the social. Her point is that once we enter this world of large numbers and statistics and normality, individual actions simply become aberrations. They lose the power to impact our common world. And to the extent that they seem out of touch with our world, we simply either see them as eccentricities that we laugh at or we sometimes enjoy, or we see them as threats which we need to expunge, but they don't have the power to actually impact events. And one of these processes, which she's arguing has become the most dominant process in modern life, is labor, in the sense of labor as the production of life as the highest value with no other values. And so this question, which says, can't we just, in a sense, produce less, consume less, and go back to the other values besides life that we have? The problem is, what are those other values? They've lost their weight in our society. According to Arendt, and I don't think she's wrong here, there are no other common values which have the broad agreement upon them as life. And, to keep with a theme that I keep bringing up over and over again, think about the human rights movement. The reason that we now have such a vibrant human rights movement in the world is precisely because the one value we can seemingly all agree on is the protection of life. Not a meaningful life, which is what Arendt thought human rights should be, a life in a community as part of a world, but simply life in a refugee camp, in a prison even. It's better to be kept alive than it is to live meaningfully. And the reason human rights is such a powerful, popular movement from an Arendtian point of view is because it sees humans as simply species beings to be kept alive rather than meaningful beings. So I have some other questions here. Does anyone want to ask a question so I hear other voices besides my own, or should I go on with what I'm reading?
Can I make one quick, not question, but comment?
Yes.
I think that the key, I think that labor, work, actions aren't, 3 major distinctions of human activities. I mean, there is no clear cut. It's just a way to see human activity from different perspectives. But Alan asked, is that which human activities really contribute to promote and protect humanity. And I think that even like bread making example, that yes, baking bread itself goes under labor. However, if someone write about great bread and the bakery, that is work. When someone bake a great bread, share with a friend, having good conversation, talking about what's going on in a society and community, that can be an action. And I think that often Arendt distinction a lot of people take so rigid, and it's just not that is what she meant.
Absolutely, Kazue. That's right. I mean, one of the I'm hoping none of you are sort of professional political theorists, because one of the things that we often get wrong in professional political theory is, there's labor, there's work, and there's action, as if they're three separate things that never will meet. That certainly is not right, and I don't think it at all was Arendt's point. These are ideal types of a sort. They're designed to help us think about human life and humanity. And the example that Kazue offers of bread and the fact that bread and baking bread can become an act that is then told stories about, right? Like maybe in the Christian religion, is true. And I used that example in my classes. There's no baking bread can become an art, it can become a craft, and it can become an act depending on how it's done. And that's why I think Rod or someone was asking a question before about the intent of the actor. For Arendt is in many ways less important than the thing produced, because while baking bread may be an act, generally the bread itself is going to disappear. We're going to eat it, and if that's the case, that would be where she would say, well, that bread produced is simply serving life, whereas the baking of the bread may have had a much broader role. Now, there are some pieces of bread that maybe are so good we take pictures of them on our phones and send them around to our friends in Facebook, and they have some life beyond simply the consumptive life, but not much. I mean, we can think about how much life Facebook has outside of consumption. And so, there are, it's all a continuum. And I think Kazue is absolutely right about that. Labor has many different aspects of its importance for human life. One is it's about creating life and growth. One is it can be in the service of duration and work, as we were discussing before, and that you upkeep your house or upkeep the buildings. But also, and this is important for Arendt in the modern times, labor as necessity forces us to work or to labor at times. It prevents utter laziness and thus reinserts us into the world. And labor itself is one of the things that pushes us out of the life of contemplation into the life of the world. And so in many ways, there's things that labor does very importantly, which is why it's one of the aspects of the vita activa. I see a question from John Bevan. One overriding thesis I get from Arendt is that economics is not the way to design humanity. Well, clearly that's her view. I want to be fair to economists here to the extent we can. Arendt reads economics here not simply as what we would think of economics today, but much more along the lines of the social sciences or the social studies more generally. It's the attempt to scientifically derive laws of human behavior, namely the common one interest of society, whether it's in anthropology, sociology, political studies, or economics, all the social sciences, that Arendt finds, or history if you're a Marxist, that Arendt finds really dangerous. Because what that does is it leads to the making irrelevant of rare individuals and actors, and thus individual action, and the elevation of rules, natural laws, or social laws, and normalities that, in her mind, replace action with behavior. And so she is critical of economics, but the economics she's critical of is simply one of the social sciences. It happens to be the one that has become somewhat dominant. Although political science, if you understand political science as the study and science of security and the common good, becomes almost indistinguishable from economics in an Arendtian understanding. And so political science and economics would merge from in that point of view. We have another question from HMM, but how independent are scientists today? Are they really influenced? Oh yeah, do you want to ask a question? No. Aren't they really influenced by economic orders, sponsoring, and etc.? Yes, I mean we can be critical of. I'm not saying that our current scientists are actors. When I said that before, we can do a sociological critique of current science and say that it's become largely co-opted by business and security interests, and it's not actually trying to insert new ways of thinking and being into the world, but largely conforming and confirming old ones. Do you have a question?
Yes, yes, I do. I was just wondering about you referred to the loss of values earlier on, and that these values we were talking about happiness have lost weight, and I have a problem relating that to otherworldliness as well as to other parts of the world, because which world are we talking about when we say that values have lost weight, when actually most of the times in the southern part of the globe, even though it looks like people have a less what we would call less value in terms of their rights and quality of life, yet they live on values. They live on values. Without these values like Ubuntu, and even though they are questionable, there is almost a very huge vacuum.
Well, that's an excellent question. It'll probably be our last one. So let me see if I can do it justice. I certainly don't want to say that we live in a world without values anywhere. I mean, not only in South Africa with Ubuntu, but also in New York. There are values and there are good people who act according to values on a regular basis. The point she's making is not that values have disappeared. It's related to what in her work and work of many others would be called the death of God and nihilism, which is not a world without values, but a world without the highest value. The idea of nihilism is not that there's no values. There's lots of values. In fact, the problem with nihilism is there's too many values, right? On the one hand, we value courage, and on the other hand, we value meekness, and we say turn the other cheek. On the one hand, we value wisdom. On the other hand, we like people who are not too wise and humble. The premise of nihilism, as she understands it through Nietzsche, is that there are an inflation of values, and there are so many values that not one of them becomes dominant, And we live in a world in which the highest values devalue themselves, the Umwertung aller Werte. And in such a world where the highest values devalue themselves, people here and there can act for a value, but those values don't ever and can't establish themselves publicly as the highest values. And we may, in our group value intellectual openness and honesty, and we may value books over money, or we may value justice through generations in the idea of Ubuntu. But when it comes down to making brass tacks decisions in the world, right? We end up, she's arguing, reverting back to a kind of utilitarian economic calculus. Human rights, is it worthwhile intervening in order to preserve this? What is it that we're willing to intervene for? Is it to preserve justice in the world, or is it to preserve life? There's almost no meaningful human rights intervention in the name of justice. They're all done, in the end, about preserving life. Not because all the people acting don't care about justice. Many of them care more about justice than about life. But the articulation of the human rights activity in the language of life is appealing to a wider number of people than one about justice, because people disagree about what justice is. And some people think justice is the victory of the opposition in Syria, and some people think justice is the victory of Assad in Syria. And so what we can agree on is life. And so I don't want in any way to say that we've gotten rid of values and that there aren't communities of values in the world. There are. Her argument is that in the modern world, in the scientific world, the value that gets the value that has become widely accepted and publicly acceptable as a value, the only one really that we accept today is utility and happiness, the principle of utility, that what benefits the greatest good and hurts the fewest number, the max-min principle. Now, we can certainly find examples where that's not the case, and that's great. But that's what she's saying, is that this has become the dominant public value in the world. I don't know if you find that to be wrong. I'm happy to hear that, but that's what her argument is. Does that make sense to you, or does that seem wrong to you?
No, it makes a lot of sense to me in some ways, and I think it's something I can think about and read more. I didn't by any chance mean that the total disappearance of values, but what you have said makes a lot of sense. I have seen values, Ubuntu, justice, not just in South Africa, but in many societies when there's a crisis, like seem to vanish. And then it's utilitarian and people are looking for their immediate happiness. It's something I can think about longer.
Yeah. Well, that's what I think she's getting at. So thank you all. These are hard chapters. This is probably some of the hardest chapters in the book because it's a lot of Marx. And as I said, she often is not bringing her argument fully to conclusion, which she only does at the end of the book. But I think you'll really find sections 14 through 17, the end of this chapter on labor, more immediately accessible and meaningful than the first three. So we'll talk about that next month, and I look forward to seeing you all then. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.